August 6th, 1944. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge stood in his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, staring at a map that promised either salvation or suicide. There was no middle ground. Von Kluge was 52 years old. He was not a fool. He had commanded armies in Poland, in France, in Russia. He had seen the Wehrmacht at its peak, watched it conquer nations in weeks. Now he was watching it bleed to death in the hedgerows of Normandy. But on this evening, Adolf Hitler had given him one final chance. One massive blow that would reverse everything. Under von Kluge's command were 4 of the finest panzer divisions remaining in France. The 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and 2 elite SS formations, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Together, they had assembled roughly 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs, plus dozens of assault guns. The last armored reserve Germany could scrape together in the West. Von Kluge did the math with the precision of a man who knows his life depends on the numbers. The American Sherman tank was a reliable machine, but it was outgunned and under-armored compared to the Panther. A Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman from nearly 2,000 meters. The Sherman's gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. Technically, on paper, in a straight fight, 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs should annihilate anything the Americans could throw at them. The objective was elegant in its ambition. Smash through the thin American line at Mortain, drive 20 miles west to the coast at Avranches, cut General Omar Bradley's forces in 2, trap General George Patton's Third Army in Brittany, severed from its supplies, force the Allies into a catastrophic retreat. Hitler called it Operation Lüttich, named after the German victory at Liège in 1914. He believed it would throw the Americans back into the sea. Von Kluge believed it would get his army destroyed. He had told Hitler exactly this. He had argued that the forces were too weak, that American air power was too strong, that the offensive would expose his flank to encirclement. Hitler's response was categorical. Proceed as ordered. There was no discussion. There was no appeal. The bomb plot against Hitler had failed just 2 weeks earlier. Von Kluge was already suspected of involvement. Refusing this order would mean a noose, not a court-martial. So von Kluge gave the orders. No preparatory artillery barrage to preserve surprise. Attack at night to avoid the American fighter bombers. Concentrate everything on a narrow front. Punch through to the sea. By all conventional military logic, this should have been terrifying for the Americans. 200 panzers, including the deadliest tanks on the Western Front, striking without warning in the darkness. But von Kluge was making a calculation based on 1940 logic in a 1944 reality. He assumed tank battles were decided by armor thickness and gun caliber. He did not know his attack had already been betrayed before a single engine started. 3,000 miles away in England, in a country estate called Bletchley Park, British cryptographers had been working on intercepted German radio traffic for days. The Germans used a cipher machine called Enigma that they believed was unbreakable. It was not. The British had cracked it years ago, and the intelligence they produced was called Ultra, the most closely guarded secret of the entire war. On August 6th, German radio discipline collapsed. The 2nd Panzer Division broke silence to request night fighter support for an attack near Mortain. A follow-up message confirmed that the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich would drive west toward Mortain at 8:30 that evening. The messages went to Bletchley Park. Within hours, they were decoded and transmitted to Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group. Bradley was not a dramatic man. He was not given to grand gestures or theatrical statements. But when he received the ultra intercepts, he understood immediately what they meant. The Germans were not retreating. They were attacking, and they were attacking exactly where his line was thinnest. Bradley had two choices: pull back his forces and surrender the ground the Americans had fought weeks to capture, or hold the line and trust his men to stop 200 panzers with infantry, artillery, and air power. He chose to fight. He contacted Lieutenant General Elwood Quesada, commander of the 9th Air Force. He coordinated with Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst of the Royal Air Force. Every artillery battalion that could reach the Mortain sector was rushed forward. The trap was set. At 2 in the morning on August 7, 1944, the leading elements of the German attack rolled forward into the darkness. A thick fog had settled over the Norman countryside like a burial shroud. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. The panzer commanders peered through their periscopes, barely able to see the tank ahead of them. In theory, this should have helped. American aircraft would be grounded. American gunners would be blind. The attack fell hardest on the American 30th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Tennessee and the Carolinas, nicknamed Old Hickory. These were not elite troops. They were farmers, factory workers, clerks, men who had been civilians 3 years earlier. Their 57mm anti-tank guns were nearly useless against Panther frontal armor. They had bazookas, machine guns, rifles, and guts. The Germans hit them like a hammer striking glass. Within hours, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich had punched through the American line and captured the town of Mortain itself. They overran the command post of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment. German tanks rumbled through the narrow streets. German infantry fanned out through the buildings. It looked like the breakthrough Hitler had demanded, but the Germans had made a critical mistake. In their rush to capture Mortain, they had bypassed a rocky, steep hill rising just east of the town. The Americans called it Hill 314, after its height in meters. From the summit, you could see for 18 miles in every direction, all the way to Avranches. It was the perfect observation post, and 700 American soldiers were dug in on top. The Germans surrounded the hill. They sealed off every approach. They pounded the American positions with mortars and artillery. They sent waves of SS Panzer Grenadiers charging up the slopes. And every single attack was shattered by a weapon the Germans had not anticipated. On the summit of Hill 314, 2 young forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion crouched near the rocks with radio sets and binoculars. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz and Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss could see everything below them. Every German tank, every German truck, every German infantry column moving toward Avranches. They had direct radio contact with American artillery batteries miles behind the lines, and they began calling in fire. American artillery doctrine in 1944 was the most sophisticated in the world. Multiple batteries positioned at different distances and angles could calculate firing solutions that would bring all their shells down on a single target at the exact same instant. The Germans called this Hexenkessel the witch's cauldron. The Americans called it time on target. When the fog began to lift around noon on August 7th, the forward observers on Hill 314 went to work. A column of Panthers moving down the road toward Avranches. Fire mission. Coordinates transmitted. Within minutes, dozens of shells from multiple batteries converged on that single spot simultaneously. No warning, no ranging shots, just sudden, total devastation. White phosphorus shells burst in the air, showering burning fragments that forced German troops into the open. High explosive rounds followed, cutting them to pieces. German tank commanders who opened their hatches to see what was happening were killed by shrapnel. German infantry riding on the tank decks were swept away. The attack toward Avranches ground to a halt under a continuous rain of steel, but the hill was just the first trap. As the fog lifted, the second trap opened above the German columns. Bradley's coordination with the Allied air forces had produced an aerial armada, RAF Typhoons armed with 8 60-pound rockets each. American P-47 Thunderbolts carrying bombs and machine guns. Hundreds of aircraft that had been waiting since dawn for the weather to clear. At noon, the first Typhoon squadrons arrived over the battlefield. Wing Commander Charles Green had briefed his pilots that morning with barely contained excitement. "This is the moment we have all been waiting for, gentlemen. The chance of getting at Panzer tanks out in the open. And there are lots of the bastards." The pilots found German armor spread across the Norman countryside like targets on a firing range. They attacked in continuous waves, one squadron relieving another in a rotating cycle of destruction. Rockets screamed down into tank columns. Bombs cratered roads and blocked retreat routes. Machine gun fire raked soft-skinned vehicles and infantry. Later analysis would show that the rockets and bombs were not as accurate as the pilots believed. The kill rate from direct air attack was lower than claimed, but accuracy was not the point. Terror was. A Panther tank was designed to shrug off almost anything the Allies could throw at it from the ground, but it was not designed to survive a 60-pound rocket punching through its thin top armor. It was not designed for its crew to sit inside a steel coffin wondering if the next screaming dive would incinerate them. Many German tank crews, especially the inexperienced replacements, rushed to fill Normandy's losses, abandoned their vehicles intact rather than face the aircraft. Operational Panthers were left sitting in fields because their crews had fled. The German Luftwaffe had promised air cover. 1,000 fighters, Hitler had demanded. What the Luftwaffe delivered was nothing. American fighters intercepted every German aircraft that tried to reach the battlefield. The German pilots could not even get close. General Hans Speidel, von Kluge's chief of staff, would later write that the armored operation was completely wrecked exclusively by the Allied air forces. By nightfall on August 7th, the German offensive had stalled completely. 5 panzer divisions had been unable to punch through a single American infantry division with fewer than 6,000 riflemen. The furthest German advance had reached within 2 miles of Avranches, close enough to see the town, not close enough to matter. But Hitler refused to accept failure. On August 8th, he ordered the attacks to continue. He demanded that von Kluge commit more forces. He insisted that one more push would break through. Von Kluge knew this was suicide. The American Third Army under Patton was already driving east toward Le Mans, threatening to swing north and encircle the entire German force. The British and Canadians were pressing south from Caen toward Falaise. Every hour the Germans spent attacking westward toward Avranches was an hour closer to catastrophic encirclement. But Hitler would not listen. Proceed as ordered. For 5 more days, the battle raged around Mortagne. The 700 Americans on Hill 314 held their position against repeated assaults. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. They ran out of medical supplies and radio batteries. The artillery battalion tried to resupply them by firing shell canisters packed with plasma and batteries, an improvised solution born of desperation. On August 10th, 12 C-47 transport planes flew over the hill and dropped supplies by parachute. Half the bundles drifted into German lines. The Germans captured American rations and ammunition while the men they were besieging starved. Still, the hill held. 300 of the 700 defenders were killed or wounded over those 5 days. But the forward observers kept calling in artillery, and the artillery kept shattering every German advance. Meanwhile, the air attacks continued without mercy. RAF Typhoons flew 294 sorties on August 7th alone, firing over 2,000 rockets. Day after day, wave after wave, until the roads around Mortain were choked with burned-out vehicles and German dead. On August 12th, von Kluge finally received permission to withdraw. Hitler had at last recognized the obvious. The attack had failed. The Germans began pulling back toward the east, leaving behind a graveyard of armor. The final accounting was devastating. Of the roughly 200 Panthers and Panzer IVs that had begun the attack, German records documented that 120 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. More than two-thirds of the committed armor gone in less than a week. Many of the remaining vehicles were damaged, out of fuel, or mechanically disabled. When von Kluge's staff tallied what was still operational and capable of fighting, the number was catastrophic. Perhaps 40 tanks, perhaps fewer. The exact figure depends on which report you believe and what you count as operational. For practical purposes, the panzer force that had attacked Mortain ceased to exist. American losses were significant but sustainable. The 30th Infantry Division lost approximately 1,800 men killed and wounded, including the 277 who fell defending Hill. 314. Tank and tank destroyer losses across all American units in the sector totaled perhaps 40 vehicles, losses that were replaced within days as fresh Shermans rolled off ships at the Normandy beaches. But the true cost of Mortain was not measured in destroyed tanks. It was measured in what happened next. By attacking westward, von Kluge had pushed his armies into a salient, a bulge in the line that was now threatened from three sides. Patton's Third Army was swinging north toward Argentan. The British and Canadians were driving south toward Falaise. The gap between them was narrowing by the hour. Von Kluge saw it coming. He had warned Hitler. Now his warning was becoming reality. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were being herded into a pocket, a killing ground that would become known as the Falaise Gap. Within 2 weeks of Mortain, tens of thousands of German soldiers would be dead, wounded, or captured in that pocket. The Wehrmacht in France would be shattered beyond recovery. On August 19th, Gunther von Kluge was relieved of command. Hitler blamed him for the failure at Mortain, suspected him of treason, summoned him back to Germany to face interrogation. Von Kluge knew what awaited him. Somewhere on the road back to the Reich, he swallowed a cyanide capsule. His last message to Hitler read, "I am departing from you, my Führer, as one who stood nearer to you in spirit than you perhaps realized. The Battle of Mortain is often overlooked. It sits in the shadow of D-Day and the liberation of Paris. It does not have the drama of the beaches or the triumph of marching down the Champs-Élysées, but it may be the most important battle for understanding why Germany lost in the West, not because it was massive, but because it revealed the truth beneath the machinery. The Germans had built the finest tanks in the world, Panthers that could kill Shermans from distances where American guns were useless. Crews trained in the traditions of Blitzkrieg, men who had conquered Europe. And none of it mattered. It did not matter because 700 infantrymen on a rocky hill had radios connected to artillery battalions that could drop steel on any target within minutes. It did not matter because Allied air forces could put hundreds of aircraft over a single battlefield and keep them there all day. It did not matter because when American tanks were destroyed, new tanks arrived from an industrial machine that stretched back across the Atlantic to factories in Detroit and New Jersey and Ohio. The Germans built knights in shining armor. The Americans built a system, a network of eyes on hilltops, guns behind the lines, aircraft overhead, ships crossing the ocean, factories working 3 shifts. Every piece connected, every piece replaceable. At Mortain, 200 of the deadliest tanks in the world charged into that system. They were ground down by shells called in by lieutenants with radios. They were burned out by rockets fired from aircraft. They were abandoned by crews who could not endure the terror of fighting an enemy they could not see and could not escape. Only a fraction limped back to German lines still capable of fighting. The rest were left scattered across the Norman countryside, monuments to the limits of superior technology when it meets superior systems. Von Kluge understood it at the end. He wrote in his final letter that the enemy air superiority was so overwhelming that every movement in daytime was rendered impossible. Even at night, he continued, bombing attacks and flares render all movements risky. It was not courage. Both sides had courage. German soldiers were not less brave than American soldiers. It was that courage no longer mattered the way it once had. Industrial warfare had changed the equation. A brave man in a Panther tank without fuel is just a sitting target. A brave pilot in a Messerschmitt who cannot reach the battlefield is just a spectator. The Battle of Mortain proved that modern war was no longer decided by the quality of individual weapons or the heroism of individual soldiers. It was decided by the weight of systems, by the ability to see, to communicate, to coordinate, to replace losses, to sustain pressure until the enemy's will broke. Germany had built the greatest tanks. America had built the greatest system. In August 1944, in the fog and fire of Normandy, the system won. Thanks for watching Echoes of War. The Battle of Mortain proved that in modern war, the system beats the samurai. Tell us in the comments, would you rather command a Panther with no air cover or a Sherman with typhoons overhead? If you want more forgotten stories of how industrial warfare changed history, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.